So I think by now you have probably heard the usual advice like gear doesn't matter, just shoot more and stay curious. And sure, those things are very true, and I can hear myself saying that, but I think they are a little bit too abstract and too much on a macro level. It's kind of like someone giving you a sword at the start of a video game and telling you, okay, now just go defeat the final boss. So what I want to share in this video are the micro level habits and the practical tips that have actually helped me to grow as a photographer. You can think of the main quest as simply shooting more, staying curious, and stop worrying so much about the gear. But just like any good game, the real progress happens through the side and the smaller quests that help you to level up with more clarity, more focus, and just a bit more fun along the way. So the 8 tips I will share in this video are really actionable, so you can try them right away, and hopefully they will help you to shift your mindset, train your eye, and just have more fun in your regular photography practice. So the first tip I want to talk about is a well-known one, I guess, and it is the use of foreground. I recently got a comment that made me want to bring up this technique and why it's worth using. The comment was basically questioning the point of blocking the frame with some foreground element, maybe hinting at the fact that it might be useless. But the first reason to use foreground in your photos is actually to simplify the frame and get rid of distractions. This usually means placing the camera very close to a wall, a lamppost, or a window frame, really anything that fits the environment you're shooting in. Then you adjust the position of your camera to get the composition right, and intentionally covering the visual mess with the foreground element to make the shot cleaner. So let's have a look at some examples, and in this first photo, if I hadn't used the foreground, the sidewalk full of people, colorful flags and other distractions would have crept into the frame, making it way less clean and intentional. So adding foreground not only helps to clean up your composition, but it also adds texture, depth and more layers to your photos. Coming back to these examples, you can see it adds a bit of an abstract reflection, which gives more complexity and mood to the photo in the best sense of the word. You can also use foreground to add a sense of mystery to your images, like in this one, I used the tree in front of me to cut the upper bodies and the heads of all the people in the frame, except for the little girl. In this other shot, I used the texture and the little marks on this mirror-like surface. I focused on it and waited for someone to walk into the frame, trying to position the scratch area right over their face. I think it works well at adding a little bit of mystery and also keeping the subject anonymous. Foreground is also about shooting through things and people, and shooting through objects, like I just mentioned, is mostly about adding texture, depth and cleaning up the frame. It can also help to frame your subject, but on the other hand, placing people in your foreground and shooting through them can really add context and story to your shots. This one is one of my favorite photos, and it really works because it combines a photo of the floating torii in Miyajima with these young students in the foreground. The main focus was the torii, but I saw these guys hanging out and thought they would make the perfect foreground to add more context, story and mood to the photo. They were probably on a school trip, having fun but also looking a bit bored, maybe thinking about what joke or silly thing to do next to make the group laugh. So adding foreground in your photos is a very powerful technique that works in different situations and with different purposes. And it doesn't require any fancy gear, because even with an APS-C camera or a cheap f4 lens, it will create all the layers, the depth and the separation without having to use an expensive prime lens wide open. One of the challenges you'll face when trying to take more photos and make photography a habit of yours is knowing what and where to shoot. There will be days, and actually a lot more than you think, when you will not have direction and you just won't know what and where to shoot. Instead of using this as an excuse to not go out and shoot, or maybe even telling yourself that you are also productive at home thinking about the next photo project or what location to cover next, you should just go out with your camera and walk towards the light. Of course, this tip works best when you have some decent weather and some sunlight, but it can also work in overcast situations and in covered areas. You just have to try to place yourself in a darker area and shoot into a brighter one. When you do your photo walk facing the light, you'll naturally encounter more interesting lighting situations. You'll get beautiful backlighting where the sun is behind your subjects, creating some soft glow effects, rim lights and a sense of separation. You'll notice long shadows stretching toward you, which can add drama and strong leading lines to your compositions. Silhouettes become easier to capture, giving a graphic and a minimalistic feel to your shots, and overall you'll get more contrast to play with, and having the light in front of you or coming from the side will give your photos more depth and more pop. When you look at some photos and you think that they are so sharp and crisp, it rarely comes from the gear itself. Nowadays, almost all lenses and camera have more than enough sharpness, so that crisp look often comes from backlit or angle lighting situation. The light wraps around the edges of everything in your frame, buildings, objects, people, or nature, and creates a lot of definition and separation between the bright and dark areas. This is what creates the contrast, the crispiness, and that feeling of sharpness. Walking toward the light also shifts your attention. Instead of looking for specific subjects and complaining that they are not out today, you start noticing how the light interacts with the environment, how it bounces off buildings, how it cuts across the street, and how it frames people and objects. You'll see that what you usually consider familiar and boring can suddenly become the star of the show and worth photographing thanks to the light. This place, for example, is just next to where I live. It's not special to me, and when there's no good light or where I'm not facing it, I would never think of taking a photo of it. But in this case, it's just beautiful. Same here, a very familiar landscape for me, but captured at the right angle with the right light, it turns into a cool shot. When you focus on light first, the subject often comes second, but that's okay. You're capturing more like the atmosphere, the mood, or even emotion, which sometimes can be even more powerful than the subject itself. So the next time you feel stuck or uninspired, don't overthink it, just head out, face the light, and let it guide you to your next shot. So the third tip today is about the rule of 3, and I've already talked about it in my channel, but I want to use this video to expand on it a bit more. The rule of 3 is a composition technique or a principle that suggests that any elements, subjects, or objects that come in a group of 3 in a photograph will create a visually appealing effect. Observing examples of this rule in action shows how it can enhance harmony and introduce more dynamism into your compositions. Interestingly, the rule of 3 brings visual balance without symmetry. Even numbers like 2, 4, and 6 can often feel too symmetrical or a bit too closed. There's something about the number 3 that feels very natural to us. It creates a sense of balance without being too rigid or too stiff. With an odd number, especially 3, you often get a central subject flanked by 2 other ones, creating a balance that feels dynamic rather than static. The rule of 3 is also great at leading the eye. Groups of 3 can give a photo some rhythm and flow. The eye tends to move smoothly from one element to the next, creating a more dynamic and pleasing image. Also, our brains are wired to look for patterns, but we find slightly broken or uneven patterns even more engaging. A group of 3 flowers, birds, or vehicles, for instance, often feels more organic and less staged than a group of 2 or 4 of the same subject. And in the end, this tip is not really only about the rule of 3. You can apply the same idea with another composition technique like symmetry, negative space, or looking for a specific color. The idea is to pick one composition rule or idea, keeping it in mind and use it as a trigger to guide you in your next shoot. Having a focus like this gives you direction and keeps you more engaged when you're out shooting, and it can turn an aimless walk into a real and intentional practice session. Over time, it can really help the way you see and compose your images. Another challenge when you do photography, and even with a lot of experience, but more so in your first months or years, is taking photos that are concise and simple, but in a good way. And one thing that can really help you to simplify your compositions is using a tighter focal length. When you're just starting and you want to think a bit more intentionally about your composition, you'll notice how overwhelming it can be to deal with everything in the frame, and the wider you shoot, the harder it gets. With a wide lens, you often have just too much going on, more distractions, more elements, and just more chaos to manage. But when you use a tighter focal length, something like 50 or 85mm for street and travel, it works really well. Above that, it starts to be very tight, and we are not on a safari ride. With such lenses, you're naturally forced to focus on fewer things, the field of view is narrower, and that limitation actually makes things easier. Instead of trying to fit everything in your photo, you start to pay more attention about shapes, line, colors, and light. You'll isolate your subjects more naturally, and your compositions will start to feel more intentional and more clean. You have fewer options, so you'll feel less overwhelmed by that urge to capture everything. I really started to enjoy photography, and especially in the streets, when I got myself an 85mm prime. My photos back then were not the best, mostly because of my lack of experience, but I started to get a better grasp of things and add more clarity in my practice. Over time, I widened my focal lengths, going down to 50, 35, and even 28 when I was shooting more with my GR3. Now I really like 35 and 50 for the look they produce, and I feel very comfortable to shoot as wide as 35. So switching to a tighter focal length for a while can really help to simplify your photos and lead to more focused and satisfying images. The good news is that a good old Nifty 50 is very affordable, so if you don't already have one, you wouldn't have to break the bank to get you started. The next very simple thing you can implement in your photography practice to have more fun and just shoot more is playing with different aspect ratios. You probably know what they are and how to change it in post when editing a photo in Lightroom, but what I want to talk about here is the aspect ratio in camera when you're actually shooting. Now some cameras let you display some black bars or choose between different aspect ratios. For example, on my Sony a7C II, I can add black bars to get a CinemaScope style, very wide and thin aspect ratio. And doing this in camera while shooting will force you to compose very differently. Suddenly there's less vertical space to work with, so you have to think about the horizontal flow, the balance, and how your subject sits within that wider frame. It's a great way to break out of your habits and challenge your eye to see differently and look for new compositions. This kind of wide formats like CinemaScope or Expand have a really unique feel. They stretch everything and give your image this cinematic and expansive atmosphere. It's very fun and refreshing, and it can give you a new perspective on your everyday landscape, especially when you think that what you have around you is just too familiar, boring, and not worth photographing. Shuffling the cards and playing with a new aspect ratio can really bring back the fun in your practice. Some cameras don't have the option to show black bars or change the aspect ratio, but most of them let you display a rule of thirds grid. Then you can simply focus on that center part and try to compose your shots within that area. So that was another tip that doesn't require any fancy gear or traveling to the other side of the world, and I think it can really help with training your eye, getting better at composing, and just having more fun shooting. The next tip is kind of going in the opposite direction from the previous one, but I think it's good to have some variety, and anyway, the goal is not to apply all these tips at the same time. So another thing you can try is turning off all the markers on your camera. So no grid lines, no horizon level, and no settings visible on the screen, just the image. Depending on the camera you use, some settings might still pop when you change the settings or press the shutter, but I think you get the point. Doing so can really set you free. It allows you to compose more freely and follow your gut, and go for maybe tilted or even crude composition when it feels right. You're no longer trying to align everything horizontally or vertically, instead you're trusting your eye and shooting more intuitively. This of course will work best with a semi-automatic mode like aperture priority, and I actually shoot in aperture priority most of the time, not just when I turn off the marker, but this mode helps you to forget about your settings and still get properly exposed photos in most situations. You let the camera handle the technical side, and then you just focus on what's around you. With fewer distractions on the screen, you become more present and more attentive to the scene, and more likely to shoot instinctively. It's a great way to reconnect with the creative side of photography and break away from overly technical shooting and very rigid composition rules. Sometimes removing control is what brings freedom and makes the process feel more fluid and more personal. The last tip is somewhat controversial because I know some people have very strong opinion about it, but I think it can be great when used in the right situations, and that's the use of headphones and music while shooting. I don't do this all the time. For example, when I'm exploring a new place, I'm already fully present, excited, and in the zone. I don't need anything extra to get me in the right mindset, but when I'm out shooting in familiar places, areas I've walked through like countless times, this is when headphones can really help. In this familiar environment, it's easy for my mind to start wandering. I'll start thinking about plans, ideas, or something I might be worried about. That kind of deep thinking can be useful, but the problem is that it pulls my attention away from what's around me. I end up not looking for compositions and barely lifting the camera at all. Wearing headphones and playing the right kind of music can really help me to create some sort of a mental wall. It stops my thoughts from wandering and it keeps me in the moment. I become more alert, more focused, and much more in tune with the visual world around me. It's like flipping a switch that helps to put me in a creative flow. I start noticing more, reacting more, and I often come away with either nicely timed moments or more abstract and instinctive compositions. Now, the type of music you choose is also very important. For example, like podcasts and audiobooks are a no-go because they pull your focus back into your head and you stop focusing about what's around you. Music with lyrics is also not ideal because your brain starts to focus on the words and it's limiting the mental space you're trying to give to photography. What works best for me is anything without lyrics and a little bit up-tempo. I love like modern jazz, movie soundtracks, or even just things that are a bit monotonous but in a good way. So if you shoot mostly in familiar places and struggle to find the motivation, you should try using music to see what it does to your focus and creativity. So those were 8 tips that I found very useful. They are not big macro ideas, but just small shifts in how I shoot and how I think about photography. You don't have to apply them all at once. Maybe you can just pick one and try it in your next photo walk, because at the end of the day, improving your photography is really about shooting more, but you have to find ways to stay engaged in the process and stick to a regular practice of photography. If one of these tips spoke to you, let me know in the comments, and if you have one of your own, I'd love to hear it. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time. Bye.